I am proud to acknowledge One Nation is polling higher than the Liberals.
Can the Prime Minister finally humble himself and just say sorry?
Late last night, our laws to crack down on hate speech and take sensible action on firearms passed the Parliament. And I want to thank all members and senators who voted for this legislation.
Welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Chris Burke, coming to you from Melbourne, and it's Wednesday, January the 21st. The year in politics has already begun, and it's stacked with new controversies, potentially a new main opposition party, and most excitingly, a new Canberra reporter for Bloomberg. To help us unpack what lies ahead in federal politics this year, I'm delighted to welcome James Mayger, who is spending his very first week in the hallowed halls of power. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's good to be here, and I hope that I can live up to that introduction.
So do I. Just joking. So James, you're actually a 14-year veteran of Bloomberg, but you've been away for quite some time. You've returned to Australia after some 25 years, I believe. How does it feel to be back?
It's great so far. Settled into Canberra. It was a nice heat wave to start the year, but it's. I've been away a long time, so Australia's very different. But I'm really looking forward to sort of getting to grips with the story and learning about my country.
And you've just returned from Beijing.
Yes, I was in China for the last 8 years, and then before that, I was in Japan for 17 years.
Great. So we look forward to some scintillating perspective on the China-Australia story in the coming months. So when you were living here all those years ago, Pauline Hanson and One Nation were a bit of a minority party on the fringes there. But look, this week we saw in the latest news poll that their support had surged to 22%, ahead of the coalition's record low result of 21%. That's around 1 in 5 Australians. Was a shift like that ever imaginable back when you were here in 25 years ago? What do you think has changed?
Yeah, it's been a real surprise to come back and see how strong One Nation seems to have become over the last 25 years. Now there's 5 members of parliament and senators in the lower house. And as you said, they're now polling better than the coalition. So to see that resurgence has been a real surprise. Although I think it sort of tracks with the collapse in a conservative vote you're seeing in other countries around the world, in Europe, in America. Conservative parties are being cannibalized by more right-wing parties. And I think you're seeing some of that with what's happening in Australia as well, with the collapse in the Liberal Party vote, weakening on the National Party vote, and then this real boom in the One Nation vote here.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that in the UK, where, for example, where Nigel Farage was once seen as a figure quite similar to Pauline Hanson, but he has now moved more into the mainstream. His party has not only surpassed the Conservatives in the polls, but they're also ahead of Keir Starmer's incumbent Labor government. What is driving this shift that we're seeing around the world?
I think in many Western countries, you're just seeing a collapse in support for traditional political parties. That's the case in Europe. If you look at the UK, as you said, both the Labor Party and the Conservatives are doing very badly, and that's also the case in Australia. And part of that is, the cost of living has risen over the past few years, and governments and central banks really weren't able to deal with that in a quick way. Some of it is, the fracturing of, especially on the Conservative side, where part of the party or part of the party's support is against, higher immigration. Other parts of the party's support wants to do much more on climate change, for example. And that kind of fission or that split in the Conservative support here in Australia is one of the reasons why the Liberal Party did so poorly at the last election. But you are seeing that, as you said, the Labor Party popularity in the UK has plummeted. Part of that is just that they don't seem to be very good government, and so I think that hasn't been the case so far in Australia. Anthony Albanese is less popular than he was last year. And I think part of that is how he handled the Bondi, the aftermath of the Bondi attack. But he's still doing better than UK Labour is at this point.
Right, and I also note that Farage's reform has actually slipped back in polls recently. But look, you were up very late on Tuesday night on your first week in the job, tracking the passage of the gun laws and the hate speech legislation that was that did get passed, albeit the hate speech was watered down a bit. That's been a pretty messy affair since the Bondi attacks, and it's really exposed the deepening divisions within this parliament, and I guess politics generally. Did Albanese get a good outcome on Tuesday, do you think?
I mean, the Prime Minister he seemed very satisfied with the result that they got. He was able to pass both of those pieces of legislation. Even though he said that the racial vilification part, they had to give that up because they couldn't get the support of the Senate. So he seemed pretty satisfied this week when he spoke after the legislation was passed. But I think it's a good example of what we're going to see going forward. You know, the government doesn't control the Senate. And so they had to get the support of the Greens for the gun legislation. They had to get the support of the Liberals for the hate speech legislation. The Nationals didn't vote on that, and that kind of horse trading that we saw this week in Canberra is probably a pretty good indication of what we're going to see going forward as the government tries to get bills through the parliament without having the Senate.
Look, what is all this kind of these local and global ructions? What do you think it signals for the year ahead in Australian politics?
So Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, is speaking in Davos this week. And he said, I think he really gave a really good speech that people should go and look at. But basically he said the old rules-based system that we all talked about, had its problems, but it kind of worked for everyone, and we closed our eyes to the problems that did exist. And we can no longer do that. We can't close our eyes to the collapse of the system that we used to believe in and we used to work in, and we have to find a new way to deal with the world as it is. And that's the case for foreign policy, and that's the case for domestic policy as well. And so the Albanese government is going to have to try and work out now, how do they deal with a US that is trying or threatening to invade part of Europe? How do they deal with China, which is threatening to invade Taiwan? There are lots of questions in our region and that they will have to answer. I mean, Albanese was asked this week, would Australia be joining President Trump's peace board for the Middle East? And he kind of brushed it off by saying, I've been focused on other things so far. I've been trying to get this legislation done. But those questions aren't going to go away.
No.
How does Australia deal with our main security ally, which is the US, which is increasingly unstable, increasingly unpredictable? And, are you sure that they really have our back? If they're willing to throw NATO under the bus, are they willing to throw ANZUS under the bus? So, these are the questions that Australian politics is going to have to deal with this year and going forward. And that international instability is also going to flow through to the domestic political situation as well.
It's interesting you brought up that Mark Carney speech that was gaining a lot of traction on social media on Wednesday, and a lot of praise actually from people who were saying, look, here's a politician talking very frankly about a very serious situation. And speaking of geopolitical crises, you've been in Beijing for the past 8 years. What's your take? I'd be interested to hear what your take is on the China-Taiwan dispute, which is becoming a lot more relevant now that we are seeing these changes in the world order. How worried do you think we should be in Australia from your perspective?
I don't think that China is going to invade Taiwan anytime in the next few years.
That's a relief.
I don't think that the risk of China invading Taiwan And the risk of not succeeding in that invasion is still quite high.
Right.
The Taiwan Strait is very wide. It's very hard to do an amphibious landing. And no matter how much bigger the Chinese military is compared to the Taiwanese military, and if you include the US military, the risk is still very high that they don't succeed. And if you're sitting in Beijing, looking at that, weighing up the risks, and also if you're very confident of China's future, if you think in 5 years' time, China's going to be stronger, the US will be weaker, Taiwan will be weaker, why would you take that risk now when in 5 or 10 years' time, maybe it will just come back without a fight? So I don't see a war happening in the Strait, even though lots of people like to talk about 2027 as some kind of date that the Chinese have set. That being said, there is a lot of problems that could occur in East Asia. There are a lot of conflicts that could occur or issues. I think back to the 2000 or 2001 when a US plane and a Chinese plane crashed into each other. Those kind of problems could occur at any time. And so people in Australia should be worried about that. But I think the risk of a full-scale war is still pretty low.
That's really, really interesting context from someone who's spent a long time in Beijing, and I think that's a completely separate podcast, one for us to think about. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. James, I'm going to leave the last word to you. What's your big call for 2026?
My big prediction for this year is not particularly risky, but I'm going to say more chaos. I think we're looking at what's happening with Greenland and whether that does end up in America's hands this year or whether the Europeans are able to push the Americans back, I think is still unclear. But generally around the world, I don't think things are going to become more stable. You've got an election in February in Japan, and even if Takaichi-san does well, you're still going to have a government with a minority upper house, which is going to struggle to deal with the problems that Japan has. And so I think more chaos, but I also think looking at it, at least from Australia, our part of the region is actually reasonably stable. Australia's got a government that has a massive majority in the lower house. Indonesia has a new president who is in power now for the next few years, at least. India's got a very strong government that it seems to be doing okay. So the world is going to be pretty chaotic, but maybe our immediate region will be a bit better.
If you found today's conversation insightful, be sure to follow the Bloomberg Australia podcast wherever you listen, and check more reading on Australia's people and politics at bloomberg.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Wurundjeri peoples. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Rebecca Jones and Ainsley Chandler. I'm Chris Burke, and thanks for listening.